Hey everyone, Sam here, otherwise known as FPL Pricey. In today's video, I'm going to be running through the key players to be bringing into your sides ahead of Game Week 12. Right then, so before we get started, just a quick bit of housekeeping for you. A huge shout out to Antonio Montana and Objectives Matt, who correctly guessed which shirt I was wearing in the last video. If you want a chance of getting shouted out on the channel, just simply guess what shirt I'm wearing right now, which team it is, whether it's home, away, third kit, and what season it comes from. The first person to get it right will get a huge shout out. In the meantime, let's take a look at one of the key players that I've got my eye on ahead of Game Week 12, and that is Alexander Isak. Now, it won't be a player that everyone can afford, and I will be going through other forwards who have been performing really well later on in the video and comparing some of them around the same sort of price point to see which one comes out on top. However, if you do have the money spare, Isak is right at the top of the list. I think he would be a priority buy for me this week ahead of almost any other striker in the game. 8.4 million is a little price drop from the start of the season when he started at 8.5. And I think that's because at the start of the season, he had really high ownership. Everyone was on him because we all remembered how good he was at the back end of last season. He's a top quality striker at the end of the day. And when he's not injured, when he's not struggling, he is one of the best in the league. He's also, when he's fit, a 90-minute man on penalties, centre forward talismanic for a pretty good Premier League side. In fact, I'd go beyond pretty good and say a very well-established Premier League side vying for European football. So Alexander Isak really does tick all of the boxes, and it's really only the price that would put anyone off at this point in time. However, the data is looking increasingly good every single week now. 0.49 XG per 90 alone is very promising. And I actually still expect that to improve a little bit. We saw last season, when Newcastle are firing on all cylinders, Isak is so central to everything they do. And he's so involved in all of their big chances. He's a big chance hoover, and everything runs through him in and around the box. So this data is actually a little bit lower than I'd expect it to be at this point in time. But they've had some pretty tough fixtures, and they're coming into a great run now where I would expect more chances to come, more big chances for Isak in particular, and hopefully a few more points to follow that as well. Now, down at the bottom, I always put in the expected points for the next 5 from Fantasy Football Hub. Always take that with a pinch of salt, but 32.5 expected points over 5 game weeks is really high, and that's at the top end of any player in the game over the next 5 weeks. The good fixture run doesn't end there either, so he's a great long-term hold. In fact, in game week 17, they play Ipswich, and then I would say the good fixtures continue generally. There are a couple of iffy ones in there, but generally speaking, they've got some of the best fixtures all the way through to about game week 24. So he's a player that you can hold on to all the way through Christmas and beyond until maybe the second wildcard. So finding a player like that is always difficult. And look, there's always injuries that crop up. There's always rotation. But what you want to do during Christmas is find someone who's so key and so talismanic to their team that the only way they get rotated is if there really is a fitness concern. Now, Isak has had his problems in the past, and in fact, even this season has missed a couple of games. But the games he's missed this season have been down to a broken toe. It's not something that can be recurring necessarily. You'd expect that to be in the past. And any sort of recurring injuries he's had in the past were sorted out towards the back end or midway through last season. And we haven't really seen them coming back since. So I'm actually very bullish on Isak this week, and he's one of the top players that I'm looking to bring in, potentially even selling Erling Haaland to do so in a bit of a double swap, upgrading the midfield with the spare money as well, of course. If you want to look at my transfer options and plans ahead of game week 12, do go back to my previous video where I do run through them in detail as well, just so there's a bit more logic applied to what I've just said there. But overall, I couldn't really recommend Alexander Isak any higher than I am currently doing. West Ham followed by Crystal Palace as a double is a great 2 fixtures. Liverpool obviously is a difficult game, but then Brentford, Leicester, Ipswich after that. I would say 5 out of the next 6 fixtures, are very, very positive for Newcastle and for Isak. And I do expect the points for Isak to continue, having already scored in his previous 3 Premier League games in a row. So now we definitely need to talk about Bruno. And he's a player that at the start of the season, I was really, really bullish on, and I put him in my Game Week 1 side. I left him in for a few weeks, but he just wasn't returning based on the data he was putting up, and that was really frustrating because the numbers behind the scenes were looking really positive, but he just wasn't getting the FPL points. And then after a few game weeks, even the underlying data started to tail off as well. Now, I think the problem with Bruno is that week on week, he might put up really good data, but as opposed to what the XG stats are currently showing right now, more often than not, he's very reliant on chance creation and his teammates finishing the chances that he creates for him. So in seasons past, and even at times this season, he's put on a really good chance or several big chances in a match, and his teammates just haven't finished off those chances. So he's always reliant on another player within Man United's team to kind of finish off and lock in those points for him. Now, despite what I've just said, the XG data so far this season is actually quite positive. 0.38 per 90 is very decent, and although that's been boosted somewhat by the 1 penalty he's had, that doesn't really throw it out of proportion all that much, and the underlying attacking data suggests that he's got a fair bit of goal threat this season. And I think another key factor is under the new Amorim system, you'd expect him to play in one of those 2 number 10 roles in behind the striker based on what we've seen Amorim do at Sporting. Now, that isn't obviously guaranteed. He could play a deeper role, but given that he is the chief creator in the current system, I would be really, really surprised if he didn't play in just behind the striker, probably on the left-hand side of that striker. And I think in that role, he's going to have less defensive duties to try and put up with than he has in previous systems under Ten Hag. You saw it in several matches, even this season under Ten Hag. He was running around his numbers when looking at the amount of kilometers he was running through every single match was really, really high. The tackle stats were high, and I don't think he's going to be putting up that much in terms of the defensive stats under the new Amorim system. Now, that is a very long-winded way of saying that he'll be freed up, and I think he'll play a more creative role and be relied on to just basically get his head down and create in the new system. And I think other players will probably take the load off of him when it comes to the defensive work. Now, that looks really, really positive for someone who's on penalties, who is historically and infamously fit for 90 minutes every single week. He barely ever misses a match. It's kind of a fantasy football dream, really. 90 minutes every match, on set pieces, on penalties, really good underlying attacking data. So what's not to love? Well, the price point isn't amazing. 8.4, I think for what I expect him to be, is actually pretty reasonable, but he's not going to be easy for every single manager to get to really quickly. A lot of FPL managers out there, like myself, are eyeing up a triple premium midfield with Saka, Salah, and Palmer. Having Bruno in there as well means that there's a really limited amount of money to go elsewhere, and it is quite difficult to maneuver. But if you can squeeze him in, I do think he's going to be a really elite differential at just 11.6% ownership. For someone of his quality, I think the upside is undoubtedly there, and I do expect him to flourish in the new system. So let's move on to the fixtures now, because I think that really does help to colour our opinion on whether Bruno Fernandes is someone that you need to be looking to buy now, or perhaps can wait for a little bit of time. Now, I think if I was making this video ahead of game week 11 and we'd already got on all of this information, perhaps we had quite a lot of it anyway, and a few people did buy him ahead of game week 11 as well, in which case props to you. But now we've only got game week 12 and 13 left before a bad run of fixtures. That is a fairly limited time frame to try and jump on Bruno Fernandes in the hope that the upside is still there. I think if you've got several free transfers and you're willing to use one of them on a fairly short-term pick, maybe you just want to hold him throughout, by the way, and that's absolutely fine. But Arsenal away, Nottingham Forest at home, who have been putting up incredibly good defensive numbers, and then Man City away, who, let's be fair, can definitely concede goals, but isn't the easiest of fixtures to pick apart defensively. It's not the greatest run. However, if you want to chase that upside, ahead of Ipswich and Everton, that's a decent double run of fixtures, and maybe you can look at just a 2-game week punt on Bruno Fernandes. Now, if you wanted to do that, there is the other option where you could look at Alexander Isak instead, and I think a lot of managers this week are weighing up one or the other and trying to figure out which one they prioritise right now. Both are on penalties, both are 90-minute men, both have great fixtures this game week, and arguably next week as well, very, very strong fixtures. Now, I think the only issue with Fernandes is that we have got a new manager coming in, so there are going to be question marks. I'm relatively bullish that this will work out very well for Bruno, but because we haven't seen it yet, maybe you want to err on the side of caution, and that's absolutely fair enough. And of course, over the next 5, Bruno does have a tougher run than Alexander Isak. So out of the two, right now, if I was to make only one transfer, it would probably be prioritising Isak over Bruno. But the upside is certainly there for Bruno as well. And once you get past game week 16, they run into a great patch of fixtures again. So, long-winded way of saying this, but I think the time is either now, you buy Bruno right now, if you've got a few transfers spare, that's absolutely fine, or you wait all the way to game week 17, and that is then also a great jumping on point as well. For what it's worth, because of my team structure and because of my limited free transfers, I'm probably going to just give him a watching brief for now and jump onto him in game week 17 and beyond. But there are managers out there who either jumped on last week or will jump on ahead of Ipswich away and could easily cash in on some big points ahead of game week 12. Right then, so let's take a look at the ideal forwards to be buying outside of Alexander Isak, who I've already discussed. And honestly, I think there are loads of options that all make quite a lot of sense going into game week 12 and beyond. There's even other options who I won't have time to talk about today, but I also really quite like. Welbeck at Brighton as well is not a bad option by any means. Evanilson at Bournemouth too, I really like. And even someone like Liam Delap at Ipswich has good fixtures and is looking really quite the part in that Ipswich shirt right now in the Premier League. So all of those are good options. I think with Evanilson in particular, because I've already got Semenyo, I probably just personally don't want to double up on Bournemouth attack. With Welbeck, I do slightly prefer João Pedro for reasons I'll go into in just a moment's time. Strand Larsen as well might not be a bad option, but I do prefer Cunha. And Liam Delap doesn't quite have the same data as some of the options that I'm mentioning here. So let's talk about those 4 options now, who I would say subjectively anyway, are my favourite 4, and all 4 are players that I'm looking at and deciding which one to bring in this game week. Perhaps even 2 of them could make the cuts. Now, starting up top left, Matheus Cunha has been absolutely phenomenal as of late, and a lot of managers have already jumped on him and got their reward, especially in game week 11 against Southampton. However, the great fixture run does continue all the way through to, I think it's game week 20. So the time is certainly still not up on bringing in Wolves assets, in particular Cunha. I think out of all of these players, the data is the worst, which is very interesting considering the price point is higher than 2 of the 3, and the fact that I think instinctively he was the first player I looked at buying this game week. 0.47 XGI per 90, with only half of that being goal threat, really goes to show, one, the kind of fixtures that Wolves have had so far this season. They've had a really difficult run, so obviously the data is going to be a little bit lower as well. But also the kind of role that Cunha plays within that Wolves side. He's actually very creative, and he's not just reliant on goal threat. He's certainly not an out-and-out forward, and Strand Larsen is much more that kind of character in the Wolves setup. So maybe there's an argument to move away from Cunha when looking at which players to buy ahead of game week 12, because he's kind of out of position in reverse. He's kind of playing that number 10 role just off of the number 9, and the data is actually split fairly 50-50 between goal threat and assist threat. Now, the reason I'm not that worried about that is because he is so creative that he kind of duly compensates for that slight downturn in goal threat with the assist threat. And as a striker, you get 3 points for the assist, 4 points for the goal anyway. So it's not really a massive difference anyway. And the one thing I really like about Cunha is the bonus points that he accumulates. Now, because he's in a Wolves side that don't score a ton of goals, they don't have a lot of really high quality players who are going to be getting loads of goals, loads of assists. They don't keep many clean sheets. Cunha, because he's good on the bonus points system, all he really needs to do is get 1 assist or 1 goal, and more often than not, he also gets bonus points attached to that. So whether he scores 1 goal, 4 points, or 1 assist, 3 points, it's usually looking like a 5 or a 6 point return either way. So with Cunha, we've seen in recent weeks, in fact, all the way through the season, he's picked up 13 bonus points already, which is really, really high for someone who is playing for one of the weaker Premier League sides, I think that's fair to say, and in a side that isn't actually scoring that many goals. So I really like Cunha. The fixtures are great. Fulham is probably the most difficult of the fixtures over the next 6 or 7, and they come into a great run after the next 4 as well. So I do really like Cunha. He is a little bit more expensive than both João Pedro and Yoane Wissa, though. Now, I'll talk about Wissa first, because I think I do actually slightly prefer João Pedro. I'll come on to him in a minute. But Wissa has the best data of anyone on this graphic, and maybe I'm just overcomplicating it and I should just be going for the one with the best underlying data. Their next 2 fixtures are also really decent. Everton and then Leicester at home, and then Aston Villa followed by Newcastle. Probably isn't the worst couple either. But I do think with Wissa, there are a few mitigating factors that make him maybe a pick that I'm a little bit more hesitant on. The first of which is that he's not usually or necessarily all the time a 90-minute man. He has had 90 minutes in the Prem this season, here and there, but it's certainly not every single week. And although he plays very much that centre-forward role, I do want someone who's as close to guaranteed 90 minutes as possible. And he's not on penalties, which is another maybe little bit of a mark against him. And Burmo obviously being the player who is talismanic for Brentford. He's got good data as well. A lot of us already own him. Do you want to own 2 Brentford assets, even if Wissa's data is slightly better? If he gets taken off around 70 to 80 minutes each match, that data needs to be kind of tallied against that a little bit and brought down ever so slightly. Now, again, this is not to say he's a bad pick by any means. I'm very tempted to go there myself because the data is phenomenal. And when he's on the pitch, he's one of their key threats in attack. And as we know, Brentford going forward, very, very potent. So he's a great option. But with Thiago coming back, you would think fairly soon. I don't think he'll get minutes in game week 12 or 13, but he might not be a million miles away now. Wissa's minutes might get managed a little bit through the Christmas period, with games coming thick and fast, midweek matches in there as well. There is a chance that he misses a match that you really ideally want him to play, and the fixture run does kind of run out fairly soon as well, and having double Brentford attack, which I would be doing if I brought Wissa as well, might feel like a little bit much when they're going into fixtures that, on paper at least, don't look the easiest to score in. Now, Brentford, again, very good going forward, so they could score in any of them, but you would expect a little bit of regression against the more strong defensive sides. So I do like him, but maybe not the top option out of these 4. João Pedro is certainly making a case to be that. Now, the upcoming fixture run for Brighton is absolutely phenomenal, and I think it will be really tempting to bring in an attacking asset for Brighton as soon as possible. If not this week, certainly next week ahead of Southampton at home. They also then have Leicester away from home 2 weeks after Southampton, so it is a great little run, even though perhaps the 2 away fixtures in there, Bournemouth and Fulham, might not be the easiest. Now, João Pedro also is putting up fantastic data. He has been a 90-minute man more often than not when he's been fit. However, unfortunately, he has had injury concerns even this season, which might put a few managers off. Now, for what it's worth, Hertzler has come out and given us some really positive quotes on João Pedro this season. At the start of the year before injury, he was talking him up as one of the leaders in the side, one of the most important players, and one of the members in the team that he can rely on to provide that spark and to be that creative energy, that life force in the team to drive them forward. Now, if that's still the case, which again, recent quotes would also suggest to be the case, João Pedro is going to be playing almost every single minute that he's fit for. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to be playing every single minute because he's got those fitness concerns. Now, if he was fundamentally like a Bruno Fernandes, where I could guarantee he plays 90 minutes because he's fit enough to, he would be an instant buy for me this game week. However, because he's got those fitness concerns and historically has been a fairly injury-prone player, I don't think it's really going to be up to Hertzler whether he can play him for 90 minutes every single week. Again, especially with midweek fixtures to come in the Premier League. They've got a lot of depth in that front four for Brighton, and there are other options that can play in his role. So I do imagine there will be the odd early sub. There will be maybe even a benching in there among the Christmas period. And it's going to be slightly frustrating if you need to rely on him as your starting striker every single game week. That being said, he's 5.4 million on penalties, and he is talismanic for Brighton when he's on the pitch. So you could use him as a fantastic option as a rotating attacker. So you don't need to rely on him every single game week. And I think if you've got a squad structure that enables that, he is probably my favourite out of all of these options because of that price point and the fixtures. Now, that's not to say you have to definitely go out and buy him this game week, because I think next week is perhaps the better hopping on point. But he's certainly a player I've got my eye on, especially because he's got the rest over the international break, and he'll be hopefully building up minutes a little bit against Bournemouth, ready for, if not a start against Bournemouth, which again I do think is pretty likely, but hopefully a full 90 minutes against Southampton is on the cards. Moving across to the final player, that being Nicholas Jackson, another player I'm really excited by. I think the datas look really good, 0.66 XGI per 90. And again, Chelsea, like Wolves, like Brighton, have some fantastic fixtures. And arguably, you could hold on to Chelsea attackers for even longer than any of the Wolves ones, any of the Brighton ones, because they are a better attacking unit and will put up better numbers over this entire period. And the fixtures to go with it are, like I said, absolutely phenomenal. Now, again, 2 of the next 3 are against promoted sides, so now is potentially an ideal point to be hopping on Chelsea assets. And the only real negative that I can put up against Jackson, actually maybe 2, the first of which would be the 4 yellow cards. Now, that isn't something that I would let you be put off from altogether with Jackson. Now, he will almost certainly have to serve a 1-game suspension at some point over the next stretch of fixtures, because he's already got the 4 yellows. He historically does tally them up pretty quickly. So I would expect that to happen, maybe even in the Leicester game. But if that's just 1 game and that gives him the rest he will need to get him through the rest of the games over this busy period, then I think he is going to be a fantastic differential, because a lot of managers simply won't be buying him because they're put off by the idea that he will be suspended for one of these game weeks. So again, if you've got an 8-strong attack and you can afford to have him maybe on your bench for 1 week when he does serve that suspension, he could be a fantastic buy even this week ahead of Leicester. And then each week you're kind of risking whether or not he has that suspension. But with the upside there, that Chelsea are a great attacking side, he's definitely their number 1 forward option at the moment, and he's putting up great data as well. The other main asterisk against him is the idea that maybe someone like an Nkunku could come in at some point and get minutes over the Christmas period. But again, I wouldn't let that put me off of him just yet, because I think fundamentally Jackson has done enough to guarantee himself a starting spot for the foreseeable future. And against teams like Leicester, Villa and Southampton, if he performs in those, there's no reason he shouldn't do, I think there's enough upside there that he will get you points in the short term, and then also he could probably lock himself into the Chelsea best 11 for the foreseeable after that as well. So just to wrap up this section very quickly, all 4 of these are great options in their own way. But for me, I think my favourite 2 right now are probably Matheus Cunha, because the price is decent. He's also very talismanic for Wolves, great routes to bonus points, and the fixtures over a long time are very decent as well. He's also so important to them that I don't see him getting a rest even in a busy fixture period. And I think that's going to be really, really important, especially in my team. The second player that I'd recommend is probably João Pedro, just for the price point, especially if you can have him as that 8th attacker. I think having someone on penalties, who is that talismanic in a really good, really strong attacking side like Brighton, is going to come in clutch at some point over the next few. And that next little patch of fixtures against Southampton, Fulham, and then Leicester after this game week is going to be really high upside as well. But don't let that put you off of Wissa or Jackson, who I also really like. So let's take a look at 4 cheapish defenders that I really like the look of ahead of game week 12 and beyond, starting off with Ryan Aït-Nouri. Now, a lot of managers have already bought him in ahead of what was a great fixture run starting a couple of weeks ago, but I don't think that if you still don't have him, you've missed the opportunity to buy him now. I don't have him in my team. He's certainly a player I'm eyeing up ahead of this game week and beyond, and I think I could hold on to him for a relatively long amount of time. And at the price, 4.7 million, I think he's a player that when the poor fixtures come way later in the season, you can look at benching him if you want to. But a player with this sort of attacking upside, we've seen how far advanced he can find himself in and around the box, even from the second or third minute against Southampton in game week 11, goes to show what his mindset is like. And the attacking data is also thoroughly decent as well. 0.18 XGI per 90. For someone this cheap, I think the upside is certainly there. And whilst with Wolves, you're not necessarily expecting that many clean sheets, I think that is kind of counterbalanced by the fact that he does pose that additional attacking threat that maybe some of the other players in this section don't. Now, if you're not really that bothered by Aït-Nouri, if you don't really back the clean sheet potential and you think that maybe the attacking potential is slightly overcooked in our own minds, that's absolutely fair enough. Konate and Colwill are perhaps maybe slightly more sensible picks that, again, you'd expect to be 90-minute men throughout the busy winter period, have good fixtures over a longer point of view, and although there are 2 rough fixtures for Konate coming up, over a longer stretch, I think Liverpool's defence is strong enough that he is going to be a good pickup and an easy and cheap route into the Liverpool defence. 5.3 million is very, very decent, and he has almost certainly locked down that #1 spot at centre-back alongside Van Dijk. Now, obviously, at the start of the season, he wasn't in favour, but I think he's put that to rest now. He's been phenomenal for Liverpool so far. The defensive data that they've put up as a team is really decent, and so far this season, it's been kind of matching what Arsenal was last year, even though they've had some pretty tough fixtures recently. Now, I don't think anyone is realistically expecting a clean sheet against Man City. Possibly even Newcastle away will be tough. But if you're looking at building a side for a long amount of time and you want someone who's a 90-minute man, locked in, bit of goal threat from set pieces, and in a team that does keep clean sheets fairly regularly, Konate could be your man. Now, cheaper than that is Colwill. Now, Colwill is a player that has been overlooked because, let's face it, Chelsea just haven't been keeping that many clean sheets so far this season. And in fact, so far, Colwill has only scored over 2 points in 2 game weeks this season. So he's a player that I expect most people will probably just put to one side for now and say, you know what, it's not for me, maybe when Chelsea improve defensively. But what I would say is the defensive data isn't actually that bad so far. It's 1.3 XGC per 90. And although Colwill's attacking threat isn't great, I do expect at the very least Chelsea's defensive numbers to improve with the upcoming fixture run. I think the clean sheets are just around the corner, and he's a very good price to be picking up right now. You might not need to start him every single week, and I do think the clean sheets are going to start coming, not thick and fast, but at a decent enough rate that he will be good value for money. Now, Villa and Tottenham in the next 4 probably isn't ideal, but away games against Leicester and Southampton is hardly bad. And then after that, the run, especially from a defensive standpoint, is very good. So I'll just read them out for you now. Brentford at home, Everton away, Fulham at home, Ipswich away, Palace away, followed by Bournemouth at home, Wolves at home. And that takes you all the way to game week 22, without a really standout difficult fixture in there. Now, that's not to say that they're going to be keeping clean sheets every single week, like I said, but I think there will be consistent enough clean sheets that at his price, it probably will be worth it. He's a bit of a steady Eddie pick, not much attacking upside, but it's not zero, and you never know. You might get lucky with an attacking return here or there to bolster what should be fairly regular clean sheets. Now, the final player I want to talk about is Lewis Hall, who is a player I'm really strongly considering ahead of game week 12 myself. He's a very good price point, 4.4 million. Obviously been called up to England. We know the player quality is very decent. And as I spoke about in the Isak section, Newcastle's fixtures for a very long time now are pretty decent too. His underlying attacking data is also not that bad. It's only 0.02 off of Aït-Nouri. So, for 0.3 cheaper in a better defensive team, maybe it does make sense to go for Hall over someone like Aït-Nouri. Now, I think the only problem with Lewis Hall is, even though he's first choice, I do still expect his minutes to be managed a little bit over the congested period to come. Now, they've got plenty of options that can play left back. We've seen Dan Burn do it, Lloyd Kelly as well, and perhaps even Tino Livramento could play at left back if Kieran Trippier were to come back in at right back at times. So I don't think he's as locked in as perhaps the other three options on this graphic, and that's maybe where he's at a slight disadvantage. However, if you're looking at a short-term pick, especially over the next 2 game weeks, and then maybe you can bolster your defense with a steady Eddie pick around about game week 14 or 15, then in the short term, I think Hall probably provides as much, if not more upside than even Aït-Nouri in the next 2 game weeks. And if you can find another defensive transfer to make, or if you've already got a strong other 3 or 4 defenders that you can pick from, by the time we get to that more congested fixture period, and when obviously Hall goes up against Liverpool in game week 14, then maybe you could just have him sat on your bench and he's easily cheap enough to make that worthwhile. So out of these 4 defenders, I think it's a bit of a head versus heart call for me right now. My head is telling me to go with someone like Colwill, who's very cheap, has good fixtures to come over a very sustained period of time. But my heart is maybe saying Aït-Nouri, not going for him right now might just be overthinking it. He's got loads of attacking threat. Wolves have got great fixtures for an extended period of time as well right now. And maybe I'd just be overthinking it slightly if I'm trying to work out when, if ever, he does get rotated over the Christmas period. As always, let me know which defender you prefer going into game week 12. I personally like all 4 of these. I've got nothing really against any of them this week. Right now, I think I'm very, very slightly favouring Aït-Nouri, but Colwill and Hall are definitely in the mix for me as well. As we wrap up today's video, please do leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed today's content. That would be greatly appreciated. And if you've got any questions whatsoever about any of these players or other players that you like the look of, do feel free to leave a comment below and I'll try and get back to you all. In the meantime, good luck ahead of game week 12. I'll be back early next week to look at some of my updated transfer plans ahead of the deadline, and I'll see you then.